It all started with a knock on the door. Not just any knock, the kind that comes with urgency, rattling the wood as if the person on the other side couldn't wait another second. It was late, close to midnight, and I just settled into the couch with a glass of whiskey in the last few minutes of a basketball game. Emily, my wife, had told me she'd be working late on a new campaign with her team. Sophie, our 6-year-old daughter, was asleep upstairs. I hesitated before opening the door. Who shows up unannounced at this hour? The man standing on my porch wasn't familiar, but his face told me he was here with purpose. Mid-30s, sharp suit, and an expression that could slice through steel. His eyes darted past me, scanning the hallway like he was trying to confirm something. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to sound calm, though I was already feeling uneasy. "You don't know me," he said, his voice low and clipped. "But I know your wife." Those 5 words sent a chill down my spine. My immediate thought was that this was some disgruntled client from her job. Emily worked in advertising, she dealt with a lot of egos. But there was something about the way he said it, like a punchline to a joke only he found funny. "Is she here?" he asked, stepping forward as though he might just invite himself in. "She's working late," I said, my tone hardening. "What's this about?" The man sighed, running a hand through his hair. He looked frustrated, maybe even a little embarrassed. For a second, I thought he might leave. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. He extended it toward me, his expression unreadable. "You deserve to know," he said simply. "What the hell is this?" I asked, not taking it. "Just open it," he insisted, his tone almost pleading. "I don't want to be the guy to tell you." Against my better judgment, I took the envelope. Before I could ask another question, he was already walking away, heading toward a sleek black car parked at the curb. I stood there, watching him leave, the envelope burning in my hand. Back inside, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the thing. It was sealed, unmarked. I should have just thrown it out. Whatever this guy thought I deserved to know, I didn't want it. Life was good, or at least good enough. But curiosity has a way of eating at you. I opened it. Inside were photos. Grainy, but unmistakable. My wife, Emily, walking arm in arm with another man. A restaurant, a hotel lobby, and finally, one of them kissing. My stomach twisted into knots. I flipped through them again, hoping I'd missed something that would explain it away, but there was no mistaking what I was seeing. The man in the photos wasn't a coworker or a friend. This was something else entirely. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the evidence, my thoughts spiraling. Anger. Confusion. Betrayal. This wasn't just a mistake. Someone had gone out of their way to bring this to my attention. But why? And who the hell was the man on my porch? One thing was certain, I wasn't going to wait for Emily to come home and pretend like everything was normal. Not anymore. I paced the living room, the pictures splayed out on the coffee table like they were evidence in a courtroom. My heart pounded, each beat a reminder of how my life was about to unravel. Emily wasn't home yet, and that only added fuel to the fire burning inside me. She wasn't late anymore, she was guilty. Every minute she stayed away felt like another lie she was crafting. But I wasn't about to let her come back and control the narrative. I was done being passive. The man on my porch had given me a gift, one I didn't ask for but couldn't ignore. Whoever he was, he wanted me to know the truth. So, I decided to get my own answers before Emily could walk through the door with hers. I grabbed the envelope again, my hands trembling. The photos were damning, but they didn't tell me the whole story. Who was this man she was with? Where had they been? I flipped the pictures over, one by one, hoping for a clue. And then I found it. Scrawled on the back of one photo in rushed handwriting was a name, Philip R. Seabreeze Motel. My blood ran cold. The Seabreeze Motel wasn't some high-end downtown hotel you'd book for a corporate meeting. It was one of those out-of-the-way places known for discretion, a place people went to make sure no one else knew they were there. My first thought was to drive there and confirm it for myself. But then a better idea came to mind. I pulled out my laptop and searched for the motel's number. I called, my throat dry as I forced myself to sound casual. "Seabreeze Motel, how can I help you?" the woman on the other end chirped. "I'm looking to confirm a reservation," I said, my voice steady. "Under the name Philip R." "Let me check," she replied, and I heard her typing. "Yes, he has a booking. Looks like it's for our honeymoon suite. Checked in at 5 this evening." My grip on the phone tightened. "And, is anyone else with him?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "I can't give out that information," she replied, her tone clipped. "If you're not on the reservation." "I understand," I cut her off, my tone icy. "Thank you." I hung up and stared at the phone. My chest felt like it was going to cave in, but I wasn't finished. There was one more thing I needed to do. I grabbed my keys and headed out. The drive to the motel took 20 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. Every mile stretched out, giving me too much time to think about what I'd find when I got there. My mind raced through every interaction Emily and I had in the past few months. The late nights, the sudden interest in taking separate vacations, her renewed effort at the gym. It was all starting to click into place, and I hated myself for not seeing it sooner. When I pulled into the parking lot, the Seabreeze looked just as shady as I imagined. The neon sign flickered, half the letters out, and the parking lot was dotted with cars that seemed to scream, "Don't look too closely." I parked a few spaces away from a silver SUV with a dented bumper, the kind of car that didn't stand out. But I'd seen it before. Emily's coworker drove one just like it. I turned off the engine and waited, my hands gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping me grounded. I didn't know what I was waiting for, but leaving wasn't an option. I couldn't go home without the truth. And then I saw them. Emily stepped out of the motel's front door, her hair down, her hand clutching a bag. She was smiling, laughing even, as she turned to the man behind her. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and looked like he belonged on the cover of a corporate brochure. Philip R., I assumed. They stood there for a moment, exchanging words I couldn't hear, before he leaned down and kissed her. I couldn't breathe. It wasn't just the act itself, it was the ease of it, the casualness. This wasn't a fling. This wasn't some drunken mistake. This was a relationship, plain as day. I ducked down, my heart hammering in my chest as they walked to the SUV. Emily got in on the passenger side, her smile still plastered across her face. My stomach churned as they drove off, leaving me sitting in the parking lot like some kind of idiot. But I wasn't done. I followed them. Not closely, just enough to keep them in sight. They drove through downtown, past all the spots Emily and I used to frequent when we were still trying to make time for each other. It felt like a cruel joke, like she was spitting on everything we'd built. Finally, they pulled into the parking lot of a restaurant. Not a chain, but a small, intimate place with low lighting and white tablecloths. Romantic. I parked across the street, my hands trembling as I took out my phone. I had no plan for what to do next, but I couldn't just sit there. I had to see more, to understand the scope of her betrayal. I got out of the car and crossed the street, keeping to the shadows. Through the window, I saw them. They were seated in a corner booth, leaning in close like they were the only two people in the world. Emily reached across the table and touched his hand, and he smiled at her like she was the only thing worth looking at. The rage bubbling inside me threatened to boil over, but I forced myself to stay calm. Bursting in there would only give her the chance to spin this into something it wasn't. I needed more than anger. I needed proof. So, I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures. By the time I got back home, it was almost 2 a.m. Emily still wasn't there. I sat in the dark, the photos glowing on my phone screen, each one a fresh wound. I didn't know who the man from earlier was or why he wanted me to know about this, but he'd done me a favor. When Emily walked through the door, her keys jangling in the lock, I didn't say a word. I just stared at her, the anger boiling just beneath the surface. She smiled at me, tired but happy, and it made me sick. "Long night?" I asked, my voice neutral. "Yeah," she replied, dropping her bag on the counter. "I'm exhausted." I nodded, watching her carefully. She didn't see the envelope on the table behind me or the photos I'd laid out next to it. Not yet. But she would. And then we'd see what kind of liar she really was. Emily didn't notice me watching her as she moved through the kitchen. She poured herself a glass of water, leaning against the counter, her face showing no trace of guilt or concern. That was the worst part, the sheer normalcy of it all. The woman standing there was still my wife in name, yet after everything I'd seen tonight, I didn't recognize her. My stomach twisted as I rose from the couch, walking toward the kitchen table. I picked up the envelope and held it in my hands, the weight of its contents amplified by the silence in the room. "Emily," I said, my voice even but loud enough to get her attention. She turned, smiling faintly. "You're up late. Couldn't sleep?" I didn't answer. I placed the envelope on the table, my eyes locked on hers. "We need to talk." Her smile faltered. "Okay, what's going on?" "You tell me," I said, sliding the envelope toward her. "Open it." She looked at it, then back at me, her brows knitting together. "What is this?" "Open it," I repeated, my tone leaving no room for argument. Emily hesitated, her hand hovering over the envelope. For a moment, I saw a flicker of something in her expression, fear, maybe. She picked it up and tore it open, pulling out the photos. Her face drained of color as she thumbed through them, her lips parting slightly. "What the hell is this?" she asked, her voice shaking. "You tell me," I said again, crossing my arms. Emily looked up, her face a mixture of shock and indignation. "Are you spying on me?" I laughed bitterly. "That's what you're worried about? Spying on you? Don't you think we should be talking about what's in the photos?" She set the pictures down, her hands trembling. "It's not what it looks like." "Oh, it's not?" I shot back, my anger rising. "Then explain it to me, Emily. Explain why you're at a motel with another man. Explain why you're holding hands at a restaurant, smiling like you've won the lottery." She opened her mouth but didn't speak, her mind clearly scrambling for an excuse. "It's complicated." "Complicated?" I leaned forward, my voice sharp. "Try me." "It's not like I planned this," she said, her voice defensive. "I never wanted to hurt you, Daniel." "And yet, here we are," I said. "So who is he? This Philip R.A. guy? How long has it been going on?" Emily looked away, her jaw tightening. "It's not an affair," she said quietly. I slammed my hand on the table, making her jump. "Don't lie to me, Emily. I followed you tonight. I saw you with him. I saw you kiss him." Her head snapped back toward me, her eyes wide. "You followed me?" she asked, her tone incredulous. "What the hell is wrong with you?" "What's wrong with me?" I snapped. "You're the one sneaking around with another man, and you have the nerve to ask me that?" "It's not what you think," she said, her voice breaking. "I swear." "Then tell me what it is," I yelled, slamming my fist down again. "Tell me why the woman I've been married to for 12 years is sneaking off to motels and romantic dinners with someone else." Emily's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, I thought she might actually tell me the truth. But instead, she started shaking her head. "I don't know how it happened," she whispered. "We started talking at work." "Of course, it's someone from work," I interrupted, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "Let me guess. Late nights, working on projects, one thing led to another?" "Spare me." "It wasn't like that," she snapped, her voice rising. "We didn't plan this, Daniel. It just happened." "Stop saying that," I growled. "People don't just fall into motel rooms, Emily. This wasn't an accident." She wiped at her eyes, her hands trembling. "I wasn't happy, okay? Is that what you want to hear? I felt trapped for years, like I'm suffocating. So your solution is to cheat?" I interrupted. "To go behind my back and destroy our family?" Emily flinched, her tears spilling over. "I didn't want to hurt anyone. But you did, I said coldly. You hurt me. You hurt Sophie. Did you even think about her? About what this would do to her? She broke down then, sobbing into her hands. I wanted to feel sorry for her, but all I could feel was anger and disgust. She wasn't crying because she regretted what she'd done. She was crying because she'd been caught. I let her cry for a moment before speaking again. How long has it been going on? She hesitated, her shoulders shaking. A few months. A few months, I repeated, the words bitter on my tongue. And you thought what? That I'd never find out? That you could just keep living a double life? Emily didn't answer. She just sat there, her head in her hands, her shoulders heaving with sobs. I waited for her to say something, anything, that would make sense of the situation. But no words came. Finally, I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor. You need to leave. She looked up, her eyes red and swollen. What? You heard me, I said. Pack a bag and go. I don't care where you go, just get out of this house. But Sophie. She's staying here, I said firmly. You can explain this mess to her when you've figured out how to be honest. Emily shook her head, her tears flowing freely now. Please, Daniel. Don't do this. We can fix this. There's nothing to fix, I said coldly. You made your choice. Her face crumpled, but I didn't care. I turned and walked away, leaving her sobbing at the kitchen table. My chest felt like it was going to explode, but I didn't look back. This was just the beginning, I knew. The real fallout was still to come. When Emily left that night, the house was quiet, almost unnervingly so. I stayed up, replaying every word of our confrontation in my head, wondering how I'd missed the signs, how I could have been so blind. I couldn't let it end there. No, she wasn't going to walk away with just tears and apologies. I needed her to feel the same pain she'd caused me. The next morning, I was up before the sun. While Sophie slept upstairs, I made a list of everything I needed to do. Emily might think she could plead her way back into my good graces, but I wasn't giving her that chance. She'd already thrown away her integrity and our marriage, now I was going to take back my control. The first thing on my list was to secure proof, solid, irrefutable proof that would stand up in court if this went to a divorce hearing. The photos in the envelope were a start, but I needed more. I remembered the name Philip Arch scrawled on the back of the picture and did a quick search online. His full name wasn't hard to find, Philip Reynolds, Senior Vice President of Marketing at the same agency where Emily worked. Married with 2 kids. Perfect. I made another call to the Seabreeze Motel. This time, I didn't ask about Philip. Instead, I asked if they had security cameras on site and if I could speak to the manager. A few minutes later, I was on the phone with a man who confirmed they did have cameras. After a little nudging, he let slip that footage was available for the past month. I'd have to visit in person to get access, but I made a note of it. Emily had been sloppy, but I wasn't going to be. By 9 a.m., I was in my car, heading to the office of a private investigator I'd found online the night before. The guy looked like every stereotype of an investigator you'd expect: gray trench coat, cheap coffee on his desk, and walls lined with photos of smiling couples he'd helped reunite. I didn't need a reunion. I needed closure. Infidelity case, he asked, barely looking up as I sat down. Yes, I replied. I need surveillance on my wife and her co-worker. He leaned back, nodding. This happens a lot. Do you have anything to start with? I handed him the envelope. Her name is Emily. His name is Philip Reynolds. They work together, and I know they've been meeting at the Seabreeze Motel. The investigator flipped through the photos, then looked at me with a smirk. You've already done half my job for me. Good, I said. Then this shouldn't take long. He agreed to follow both Emily and Philip, capturing any meetings or interactions they had. It wasn't cheap, but I didn't care. Money was the last thing on my mind. That afternoon, I made another stop, a lawyer. Divorce wasn't a question anymore, it was inevitable. The attorney I met with was blunt and efficient, walking me through the process like she'd done it 1,000 times. She didn't sugarcoat it. Divorce with a child involved would be messy, especially if Emily decided to fight for custody. Gather as much evidence as you can, she said. If she's unfaithful, and it's documented, it'll help your case. I told her about the private investigator and the motel, and she nodded approvingly. Keep everything. Emails, texts, receipts, anything that shows a pattern of behavior. And if she tries to manipulate you, document that too. Her words lit a fire in me. I wasn't just going to survive this, I was going to make sure Emily regretted every choice she'd made. The next few days were a blur of planning and waiting. I avoided Emily's calls and texts, which ranged from apologetic to angry. She left a voicemail every night, alternating between begging for another chance and accusing me of being cruel for not letting her explain. But what was there to explain? She'd lied, cheated, and destroyed our family. Her words meant nothing now. On the third day, the private investigator called. Got something for you, he said. I met him at his office, where he handed me a USB drive. Philip and Emily met at a coffee shop yesterday morning, he explained. They were there for about an hour. Lots of hand-holding, leaning in close. Then they went back to the motel. Got footage of them walking into the room together and leaving 2 hours later. I clenched my jaw, staring at the drive in my hand. This was what I wanted, but it didn't make it hurt any less. I'll keep digging, the investigator said. But this should be enough to make an impression. It was. When I got home, I uploaded the footage to my laptop and watched it twice, my anger growing with every second. Emily and Philip looked so comfortable together, so at ease. It was like they weren't just cheating, they were living a second life, completely detached from the one we'd built. That night, I started the next phase of my plan. I drafted an email to Philip's wife, attaching the photos and a short message. Subject: something you should know. Hi, Mrs. Reynolds. I'm Daniel, Emily's husband. I thought you might want to see these. It's not easy for me to send this, but I believe you deserve the truth. Best. Daniel. I stared at the email for a long time before hitting send. It felt like crossing a line, but I told myself it wasn't about revenge, it was about justice. Philip's wife deserved to know the kind of man she was married to, just like I'd been forced to see the truth about Emily. The fallout was immediate. The next morning, I woke to a string of missed calls and texts from Emily, each one more frantic than the last. By noon, my lawyer called to say Emily had reached out to her own attorney, likely to prepare for what was coming. Good. Let her scramble. I wasn't finished yet. I spent the rest of the week moving forward with the divorce. I froze our joint accounts, moved my paycheck to a separate bank, and changed the passwords on every online account I could think of. I wasn't going to leave Emily with the ability to drain our resources while I picked up the pieces. When she finally showed up at the house that Friday, she looked like she hadn't slept in days. I didn't care. What the hell is wrong with you? She shouted as she stepped inside. Why would you send those pictures to Philip's wife? Why not? I replied coolly. She deserves to know who her husband really is. Just like I deserve to know who my wife is. Emily's face twisted in anger. Do you know what you've done? You've ruined everything. No, I said, stepping closer. You ruined everything. I'm just making sure you face the consequences. She stared at me, her eyes blazing. For a moment, I thought she might hit me. Instead, she stormed out, slamming the door behind her. I stood there, my chest heaving. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time in days, I felt like I was in control. The weekend after I sent the email was the longest of my life. Emily didn't return to the house after our argument, leaving me with Sophie. I hadn't explained much to my daughter yet. What could I say? She was only 6, too young to understand the depth of betrayal unraveling her family. For now, I told her that Mommy was working on some things and that we'd have a fun weekend together. She nodded, trusting me, her small hand slipping into mine. Trust. a word that felt hollow now. On Monday, my lawyer called with an update. Emily's lawyer had reached out to start negotiations. The tone of the conversation wasn't apologetic or conciliatory, it was aggressive, demanding clarity on how assets would be divided and seeking assurances about custody. I'd expected it, but hearing it made my stomach turn. "She'll likely push for joint custody," my lawyer warned me. "If you're aiming for full custody, you'll need to show that the affair impacted her parenting judgment or put Sophie in a compromised position." I already had evidence for the divorce, the photos, the investigator's report, the motel footage, but none of it directly tied to Sophie. That wasn't enough. I needed something stronger, something irrefutable. That night, while Sophie slept, I sat in the living room surrounded by folders, printouts, and the glowing screen of my laptop. I sifted through every piece of evidence I had, looking for a connection between Emily's behavior and any risk to our daughter. Nothing. Frustrated, I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. And then I remembered the name Philip Reynolds again. If I couldn't prove Emily was a bad mother, maybe I could show Philip was dangerous. The next morning, I took a half-day off work and drove downtown to the office of the private investigator. He'd already given me everything I asked for, but I needed more. "I want to know everything about Philip Reynolds," I told him, sliding an envelope of cash across the desk. "Not just his relationship with Emily. I want his background, his habits, his life outside of work." The investigator raised an eyebrow but took the envelope without hesitation. "This'll take a few days," he said. "You sure it's worth it?" "I am." While I waited for the investigator's report, I started making preparations for the next phase of my plan. The house was mine to keep. I'd already spoken to my parents, who'd co-signed the mortgage when Emily and I first bought it. Legally, she couldn't touch it. I had already frozen our joint accounts, and I'd set up a separate savings account to ensure Sophie's needs would always be met. I also met with a child psychologist. I wanted Sophie to have someone to talk to when things got messy. The psychologist commended me for being proactive, though her approval didn't feel like much of a win. I wasn't trying to win praise. I was trying to salvage what was left of my family. 3 days later, the investigator called. "You're not going to like what I found," he said. I met him that afternoon, my hands trembling as he handed me a thick folder. Inside were photographs, documents, and a detailed report. Philip Reynolds wasn't just a cheater. He had a history. For years earlier, he'd been accused of harassment by a junior employee at another company. The case never went to trial, but the company settled out of court. A year after that, he'd been caught falsifying expense reports, though he managed to avoid termination by repaying the stolen money. And then there was the most damning piece of all. Philip had been charged with driving under the influence 6 months ago, with his wife and children in the car. I stared at the report, my jaw tightening. This wasn't just a matter of infidelity anymore. This was someone who had no regard for rules or consequences. And Emily had willingly brought this man into her life and, by extension, Sophie's life. That evening, I called my lawyer and laid everything out. "I want to push for full custody," I said. "Use everything I have: Philip's history, the affair, the motel footage. I want it all on the table." She hesitated. "You realize this could get ugly, right? Emily's lawyer will fight back, and if you involve Philip, he might retaliate." "I don't care," I said. "This isn't about her anymore. It's about protecting Sophie." 2 days later, Emily called. I almost didn't answer, but I wanted to hear what she had to say. "Daniel, please," she began, her voice strained. "Can we just talk? Face to face? What's the point?" I replied. "You've already made your choices." Her tone grew desperate. "I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. But this isn't just about us. It's about Sophie. We need to figure out a way to move forward, for her sake." "Funny," I said coldly. "You didn't seem to care about her sake when you were sneaking around with Philip." There was silence on the other end. Finally, Emily spoke, her voice trembling. "I'm not proud of what I did. But Philip isn't a bad person. You don't have to make this harder than it needs to be.